So thank you all. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Cyntha, for being here. This is part of a series where we've been exploring the spiritual sicknesses as set forth by Donalihio Ponti, who was Dr. Rosita Arvigo's mentor. And he identified certain emotional states, certain energetic states as what he called spiritual sicknesses. And we've been exploring them through Cyntha's amazing wisdom and lived experience from a psychotherapeutic perspective. Because of the events of the last month on Earth, because of the incredible flashpoints of conflict and pain, the realities of identity that are rising up, the areas where we're being asked to be more human and more humane, it felt really important to just divert away from the sequence and dedicate this gathering to ancestral community collective trauma. So that's why we're here. I'm going to hand this over to Cyntha now. And anytime you need me to chime in or anything, Cyntha, just call me. But blessings on this. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. So first of all, welcome everyone. I'm going to share my screen. So also before I share my screen, I just want to say a little bit. Summer and I have been doing these for a while now. First of all, I want to welcome the Arvigo community here. I recognize a couple familiar faces now that have been coming to these. And I also want to welcome those from my community that I see here. So welcome. And those of you that I've never met at all. So really, really an honor to be here and have you with us. A few things. Summer and I, we've known each other for a long time, since a long time, like 20 something years, just about. And we've moved into a really lovely collaboration. So Summer is in New Zealand and I am in Dubai, as she said, probably some of that. And we, you know, our Samar has taken over now the whole Arvigo training and this beautiful abdominal training program, and just this whole working with the pelvic wisdom as well as the healing modalities there. My work is definitely transpersonal psychology mixed in with somatic work and shamanic work. And I know the Arvigo whole tradition has the shamanic background as well. And for those of you that may be a bit new to that word, it's basically, or the way that we both, I know, work with it is earth wisdom, earth mysticism. And, you know, we're really fortunate at this time in our world to live in a place, in a consciousness where all these wisdom traditions are becoming accessible and are becoming integrated into our different ways. And so the lovely ways in which these different modalities, and that's one thing I really appreciate about Summer's work. And I'm so grateful to be honored and to be invited into this very sacred space and to have her trust in these teachings, because Summer is a very deep person. She's very gifted, if you don't know already her work. And she has a way of bringing these different traditions together and is very perceptive, but is extremely respectful and honoring of the traditions that she has been gifted to carry forth and carry on. So that also ties in with our theme, because when we speak of collective trauma, one aspect, and it's not the only aspect of collective trauma, is indigenous wisdom. The indigenous peoples around the world have been, you know, there's been the whole industrial revolution, the technological revolution, and that has run over a lot of the wisdom traditions of the indigenous people. And so there are people like Samar who has been, and I have someone else that's in my community, a woman named Elizabeth Jenkins. These two women are very, very close to me, and they have been, I would say the word comes to me is bequeathed. They've been bequeathed to carry on these traditions from other places that they weren't necessarily born in. And part of healing collective trauma, and that really segues in, and I wasn't planning on saying this, but it just comes so, I just feel like something's coming through me here that I want to name, is validation. When there has been collective trauma in whatever way, and we're going to define that a little bit more in a minute, but when there is collective trauma, one of the ways, whether it's personal trauma or collective trauma, that we begin to heal from is when we have been validated for it existing, for our feeling what we feel, for what has perhaps been run over or taken away or diluted or appropriated. And when that another validation is someone honoring the seriousness and the gift of those traditions that have been taken away or what's another word I want? Minimized or dismissed. That's the word I was looking for. And so the RVGO platform in which I'm invited to speak on here is a place where that Indigenous wisdom is deeply respected and validated. So I want to just start with that. So Samar and I, we were in communication a lot around socio-political realities, around healing realities, rhythms that move through our world. We just have that role to each other. And when Gaza, well, first of all, when Sher Jara, the community in East Jerusalem, was the conflict was becoming very apparent on the world stage of forced evictions, Summer and I became in regular communication. And that led then to what was going on with Gaza, and then that period of active war that went on for the couple of weeks that all that was at its height. And so then we became very aware, and we were both motivated in our different ways to really go in and bear witness. And that's another aspect of trauma, is to bear witness to whatever that trauma is, whether it's a personal trauma or a collective trauma. So it's not only validating, but it's holding space. And I know many of you on this call are healers. And one of the traits of a true healer is the ability to presence the suffering and the joy of another, to bear the hurt, the woundedness, and the successes of another, the gifts of another. So we, both in our different ways, began very actively bearing witness. Samar did in certain ways, and she can share that. But as we became in greater conversation, we saw that we needed to not only speak to the collective trauma that's been raised to a greater awareness in both Palestine and Israel, and amongst all the people that are very connected to that conflict and that history. But we started becoming very conscious of holding the space to the collective trauma all over the world, and that this concept. So there's something that, first, before I say anything more, I just want to invite you, Summer, if there's anything you want to add to my impromptu introduction here.
Thank you so much, Cyntha. It really, such powerful concepts you raised, and there's so much that was moving in me, so I'll keep it very brief, but a lot of my lived experience. I had a meeting yesterday. I've mentioned this before. We work a lot with protecting trees where we live. And one of the very interesting things about that scenario is it's an example of a decolonization project that's gone so far into what you would call vengeance politics that it ignores the fact that it's clearing away a forest. And so we're working on something here called compassionate decolonization. And I did a Google search and I couldn't find that anywhere. I couldn't find the idea that the dismantling of systems of oppression could be a compassionate process. And I was so affected, when the real intensity heightened in Sheikh Jarrah and then in Gaza. I was in managed isolation for 2 weeks. So I was in this place where there was nobody else. And I was just really bearing witness all day long. And we talked about this, but I think one of the reasons that this situation is so potent on Earth right now is that it's an intersection between Indigenous issues, trauma, creating trauma. So we've talked about this, and this is being talked about, and neither you or I can talk about it as eloquently as the Jewish community themselves who talk about it are talking about it. And that's what been, as an Arab, one of the most inspiring, beautiful things of my life, is to hear the level of consciousness, awareness, and the leading by example that's happening in sections of the Jewish community where compassion is the torch that's being followed. And it's like, don't weaponize our collective trauma. You know, these layers, like the last thing I want to say is I spent, you know, maybe 5-6 hours a day over probably about 12 days in a Clubhouse app called Meet Palestinians and Israelis. And the moderators did such an amazing job because they just went back and forth between stories. And there were over 500,000 people that came into that room. And it was the biggest peace project of its kind. And it was all about bearing witness. And I heard testimonies that you would never imagine on every side, so to speak, of that world, you know? And so we're living in a time, and then obviously in the last couple of weeks, Kamloops in Canada has raised the issues of the great pain of Indigenous peoples of North America, and also Australia has come up too, around these residential schools. And so, you know, maybe you can speak to the astrology of the Cyntha, but what it feels like right now is that our shadow is really up. And the places where we didn't feel like we had enough resource to actually view another person as a human being are up to be felt and seen. And in that process, when we speak about indigenosity, when we speak about the gifts of these traditions, I tread very, very carefully. I know how much this work has given me personally and hundreds of people that have been in my care. So I don't doubt the connection to the work. What I am really making space for is feeling the pain of the descendants of the peoples who had a lot of these traditions stolen from them. And so through forums such as this, through tithing, through uplifting Indigenous voices, through also what I'm hearing is seeing the commonality between so many groups and, you know, almost a species imperative to heal. And that's what you said about witnessing and bearing witness. I think it's a incredible moment to tell the truth. And I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Summer. Thank you. Beautiful. So where we are inspired to go with this, we recognize that this is both a healing platform and then a greater platform for a community interested in these issues, whether or not you're a said healer or not. So in order for this to make sense, we of course need to start with the personal. So I'm just going to share something here that I've put together. And is that visible, Summer, in a good way? Yeah, you can see it. Okay, great. Yeah. Great. So what is personal versus collective trauma? So when we speak of collective trauma, this is a buzzword that's been very active recently. Personal trauma is anything that can be an accident, that can be abuse, that can be loss, that can be abandonment, that can be neglect, that can be feelings that just can't be expressed. So that can be a personal experience in our own life. Collective trauma, what's so fascinating, and the science is proving this now, is that we have these little telomeres on the ends of our DNA, and they're like these little tips. And these transmit, we know this now by science, that these transmit trauma from one generation to the next generation. Now, what often happens is that transmission may happen through the next generation's DNA, but not be activated unless the environment in which that child is growing up would activate that trauma furthermore. So it can stay dormant or it can get further activated. And you can imagine certain communities, they don't get out of it. It's so hard to get, because the next generation and the next generation keep being born in circumstances that are highly charged. So we can imagine this, whether it's the Black communities well, certainly I can speak for my own country, from the United States. We can speak for what's going on for the collective trauma of Jews all over the world, and how easily it can be to be reactivated. Definitely the collective trauma as well of Palestinians. And also what I've been watching is, since I live in Dubai and I interface with so many Arabs from so many different surrounding countries, is that the collective trauma of their own country, as they've been watching what's been going on with the Palestinians, gets reactivated, even if they're not Palestinian. So the list goes on. And so now I just want to say, and this, of course, is what I'm listing here are examples that are both personal and collective. So I've given some examples here. And so we have, if I'll speak on the personal level, if you've been traumatized, if trauma has come in your way, you want to fight. That may be a reaction to fight back. And then we definitely see this in the Jewish and Palestinian examples. So the IDF, which is the Israeli Defense Forces, is a very fortified, robust, infamous kind of defense. And then Hamas, which is known and is viewed as, for some, it's viewed as a resistance group, a violent resistance group to fight back. For some, it's recognized or viewed as a terrorist group. And we see also the whole resistance movement that happened with Jews, as well as Europeans in general, whether they were Jewish or not, in the resistance. It's a very famous essence and movement in World War II. The Russian pogroms, a lot of Russians, Russian Jews used their energy to fight back against what was going on with the czars of Russia through the communist revolution. So these are examples of when you're traumatized as a collective here, how, and I give these two examples because this has been what's up so much lately. Now, the flight concept. So if you want to run away, you want to run away. So if you're a gazelle and you're being chased by a lion, you want to run as fast as you can. If you're being chased, or if you're being assaulted by somebody in a car park, you want to try to run away if you don't have the means to fight back. So we've seen the expulsion of Palestinians from their homes in the 48, as well as the 1967 wars with Palestine, Israel, and Jews with Palestinians. And then we also see, for example, Jews, what we often known as the migrant Jews or the wandering Jews is an example of people who have been moving away from oppression that they've gone through. I give the example of the huge US immigration from Russia, of Russian Jews during the pogroms of the late 19th century, as well as even recently in the incident of Charlie Hebdo, which is the newspaper in France, where there was this whole series of attacks. And it wasn't just the newspaper, but it was also a Jewish grocery store, a small little Jewish grocery store. And after that incident, there were many French Jews that had just really hit a place of extreme just saturation, and they moved to Israel. So then freeze. We see this extremely commonly amongst sexual abuse survivors when they're being attacked, just freezing in the moment. And then the Holocaust itself, the so many Jews being rounded up, as well as others as well. But mostly it's known for the Jews during World War II being and just freezing, just not knowing how to react and going with what was happening in such a alarming, traumatic manner. One of the responses to trauma is fawning, to fawn. And that's something that we know as codependency. Women can often play that out more as a collective themselves. It's where you keep the peace, where you people please, where you don't rock the boat. And it's known in Israel with the Palestinian Israelis, those Israelis who were born, who stayed, weren't kicked out or resisted, stayed on pre-48. They were there already in 48 and stayed on once the state of Israel was created. They are Israeli citizens, but often walk a very fine line to keep that citizenship and maintain in what's predominantly a Jewish state. And then you also find with the Russian pogroms, which was this mass threat and extermination and bullying and riots to try to drive Jews away, or a lot of them were told you either convert or you have to stay in your ghetto, basically. and some did out of that desire to have more freedom. I've known Jews in Paris, where I lived for a period of time, that their mothers gave them Christian names and baptized them to protect them from being killed. So there's that fawning from that point of view. And then the last example I have here is going numb, and that's chronic depression, addiction, long terms. We see this very much with all the indigenous First Nations around the world, the amount of alcoholism that is prevalent in these communities as a way to numb the feelings that are going on. And then there's another category here, and I don't know why it didn't make it to my slide. It should have. There's something that must have had, maybe didn't save it correctly. I also wrote the word hypervigilance. And hypervigilance is this place where you're always on guard. And so someone's had that trauma, whether it's been someone who's been attacked, someone who's been sexually abused, war victims, refugees. I definitely know in Dubai, there are a lot of refugees here. And I've seen that this hypervigilance, sometimes you see it, the hypervigilance translates to workaholism. I've got to work all the time. It can translate into insomnia, translate to a caffeine addiction, to like always be on alert in case I have to run, in case I need to flee. So I would add that to the thing. Summer, is there anything you want to add here, especially from the Arvigo point of view?
Not so much from an Arvigo point of view, but from a very personal point of view that interfaces with several world events. And so as you were speaking, I was having this at once coalescence of a personal and collective story. And that's that my grandmother, during partition, when India and Pakistan separated, Pakistan was formed. And it was a similar situation in a way. It's like Muslims were pushed out to form their own country. There was a lot of loss. She had to run. And so she tells the story of that time always in a very unresolved, very pain-driven way, because her father died around that time too, and that loss has never shifted. So she was 13. So it's like the beginning of her menstrual life. And then my mother also at 13, when all the issues happened with the Bhutto regime, they had to run literally for their lives from Pakistan to the US. And it was the second time this happened. And when I was 9 and the Gulf War was happening, we also had to leave the Middle East. We had to leave Bahrain and run on threat of bombs to the US for a period of time before going into Dubai. And it took years for me to actually figure out what was happening, but I would have these recurrent dreams when I left my family and was living on my, like as an adult, of these nameless, faceless men, soldiers coming to get me. Like that would just happen all the time. And the hypervigilance is definitely my whole life is something I have to deal with. But it's like the reenactment almost of this isn't safe, and creating war zones in my own life. And I would just be like, where is this coming from? And so it's been really powerful hearing this, also witnessing it in the world, but going, sometimes it's multiple conflicts, especially as we get more international, that we're holding in our own bones. And if we map our histories, it's amazing. So the hypervigilance piece is massively resonant. And I do feel like what has really helped that is just bearing witness to it and understanding like it's not actually my fault. It's an inheritance. That's what I have.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. And then what you're saying there is also really important, really, really important, because what happens often is that there's this generational patterning. And I think what you've just exemplified to us is a wonderful opportunity for us to all just think back, okay, where are there some similar patterns going on, and some key phases in our parents' lives or our grandparents' lives in terms of any of these reactions to some of the traumas, whether it was economic trauma on a collective or family level, whether it was political trauma, whether it was war, whether sometimes it can be the trauma of, for example, Katrina, a natural disaster. So these patterns definitely show up, and this is wonderful. Thank you, Summer, for exemplifying that. So I just want to say here that one of the ways to heal trauma is to the first thing, and it's number one here I have, is tell your story. And it first must happen safely amongst your own group, so that there's a place where you're amongst kindred souls, you're amongst people that understand, you don't have opposition, there's less of a likelihood of being misunderstood, so that you can, and that provides a mirroring, and it provides a safety to start to unthaw. And that's a really operative word here when we speak of trauma, whether it's personal or collective, to start to unthaw the trauma that is going on. I know that there's a Jewish friend I have that told me that his grandfather wouldn't want to speak about, he was a Russian Jew, wouldn't want to speak about what he had gone through because he had so much shame. And that's a real key word that we also need to bring in, is that whenever there's trauma, there's often shame, because there's this place that we should be more resilient, or we should be stronger, or we shouldn't be a victim, and we shouldn't be weak. And so often it's that defenselessness to the trauma that was incurred it feels embarrassing. Like, why wasn't I strong enough to fight this or overcome this? And so he told me that his grandfather would never share anything because he was just so ashamed. And that's so tragic. And so what I'm seeing too, that's really hopeful, and Summer, you brought that in, is that in these beautiful rooms, I mean, if 500,000 people are coming together, that is a shift of consciousness in itself. And I believe that what's really beautiful is that the different levels of shame that may be existing in the different groups, for example, in this case, between Jews and Palestinians, is that or Jews and Arabs, I think, which would have probably been more also really relevant in this case too, is that as the generations continue, there is a greater and greater dilution of the original traumas, as well as a greater emotional intelligence with our evolving societies, and that allows some of that shame to be dismantled, some of it. So yeah, please.
I don't want to take too long, but I just, when you speak about the Clubhouse room and about bearing witness and the safety of speaking initially in a group, and then the resilience that's come to actually be able to sit with what the world or a certain narrative has placed as the opposition to oneself, with an open heart and hear them, most powerful things happen there. I mean, I would hop on and off all through the day. And one time I remember just logging on, and I was in mid listening to an ex-IDF soldier. And this man, like, his voice croaked and then the sobbing started. And I only caught like 3 sentences, but what he said was, I was in their house, whomever's house he was in, felt like occupied territory. So he's talking about, and he said, I had 16 and my job was to just frighten people. And he said, I want you to know, I'm so sorry for making you afraid. And he just racked with like just the intensity of the crying. Like, it brought instant tears to me, and I couldn't stop, because it was such a genuine understanding of where one's own actions contributes to the trauma of another. And in the expression of that, the amount of healing that you could feel reverberating through the thousands of people who were in the room just in that moment was so profound. And without the storytelling and without the bearing witness, I don't know that people would ever get there. Like, we have all these incredible platforms now, just using this example, there's hundreds, but for people who are often either vilified or raised up as iconic heroes and soldiers, no one ever hears them or the numbing and the freezing that they have to go through. And so just validating what you're saying, but bringing in what a powerful lived experience it is that every voice gets a place at the table.
It's beautiful, Summer. Just gorgeous. Thank you for that beautiful testimony there. And then that leads me to the second place, which is tell your uncensored story to the other. And that's where we have listening circles and councils. And it's that place where you're safe. You have to have, there must be safety cultivated. And again, there must be some sense of some trauma-informed facilitators that hold this. And then also the intention of those that enter into that. But it's being listened to, mirrored back, validated, empathized with, and amends. And it sounds like this lovely man made those amends and took his responsibility for his piece. And then there's that back and forth. And basically we're seeing this, around the world, and we're seeing this more and more. So I do a lot of couples work, and I'm seeing this in the conflicts that can happen between two spouses or two partners, two love partners on a very regular basis. And it's one of the most honored kind of witnessing I've ever done, is just that absolute humility. And so whether it's truth and reconciliation between two individuals, or whether it's between one community to another community, there is something about that is highly transformative. And it's not easy. And that leads me to this last piece here, where because we come up on egos, and I just want to come here. Just a minute. I want to see if I have this here. Yes. So I want to just jump to this place here. So there's something called Zen Peacemakers International, and it was created by a man named Bernie Glassman, and who's recently passed away. But he holds bearing witness retreats on Native American lands in the US, in Black communities, street retreats where people live with the homeless and really enter on the level in which they're living. And there's three tenets, and I love this. And it's about neutralizing the ego. That we all have egos, and we all have our pride, and we all have those places where we contract. And so how do we foster an environment so that we can enter into a zone of conflict and not contract? And so these three tenets are absolutely beautiful. And the first one is not knowing, letting go of fixed ideas about yourself, others, and the universe. And so it's that place where you intentionally suspend the ego and say, I don't know. I'm willing to say that. And there's a power when you're doing it with others that support you. Okay, I'm going to do that. Will you do it with me? And there's a holding, and there's a tenderness and a compassion to the fact that we are constantly having to negotiate these ego states. So I find that really beautiful. And I love the phrasing of that not knowing and committing to the not knowing. And then the second is, once you've come off that ego posturing, then you enter into bearing witness, both the joy and the suffering. And it's not just bearing witness out there, it's also bearing witness to your own judgments and your own attachments, and the places where you become stiff, or you tighten, or you become reactive, or where you raise your voice. And it's that place, and that's why it's called Zen Peacemakers International. The idea, and we use this, we often joke, oh, he's very Zen. But Zen is that place where you still enough to simply watch, to just watch your thoughts, watch your emotions, watch your reactions. And so when you're in conflict, and if there's enough people that are doing that, it creates a collective field. So it's not just about the collective trauma, it becomes the collective healing. When there are enough people together entering into that collective space, there's an energetic shift. So that's the second piece. And the third piece is that once you've neutralized enough that ego, and you've had the courage to bear witness to those ego states within, as well as the suffering and the joy and the gifts of the other. A lot of times, there's vilification or demonization of the other, rather than celebrating their gifts. It's like, this is beautiful of who they are. And so once that's happened, then, and I love how they write, this wording is from their website, is that taking action arises from the not knowing and bearing witness. It's impossible to do that it's like what we use in this language of getting a download. A download means it's coming from something superior, something from a higher essence that transcends the ego state. And so if you're getting a download, it's in that spirit, is to get a download. Now, this is the action I need to take. And that action is something that it's a caring action. It's something that's going to be a win-win. It's going to serve. It's going to be an action that is heart-driven, that is spirit and centered driven. I would say centered. You're in your centered state driven. It is not driven from the ego. So Summer, anything you want to contribute there?
No, I'm just deeply listening.
Great. And so I want to come back to this point here. I'll come to that one. I'm kind of going a little bit out of order, but this is the right order. So some of the premises of healing are that, and I use this a lot when I work with couples, is that when the violence or addiction has hit a crisis point, it's indication of a homeopathic process, that it first has to get worse. You have to hit rock bottom to push those symptoms to the surface. So, Summer and I had a lot of discussion about this, that as the events were intensifying, which by the way, astrologically was all around the last lunar eclipse, which if any of you are into astrology, that was this moment of intensification at astrological level. I won't go into that too much right now, but I just want to name that there were definitely forces going on celestially that were interfacing with these events at the exact same time. But it hit a crisis point. And I see this often. I'll say to couples, you're each other's homeopathic remedy of the unhealed material of your past that is just craving to finally be released and heal itself and move on and be transmuted. And so the same thing happens at the collective trauma level. There comes a point where it's enough. And we certainly saw this in the United States with Black Lives Matter, and that carried out all over the world. We've seen this with the Me Too movement. And the list goes on. There's a point where it's just enough is enough, but it has to get really ugly often to really push that shadow to the surface. That's been okay. We'll adapt. We'll get on with it, but it's always there. And then it moves us into this point where we call the tipping point, or what's also another aspect of that's what's called the 100th monkey syndrome. And you can look at that. It's a phenomena that's quite spectacular. If you don't know it, there was some scientists that were observing these monkeys. They were teaching them how to peel a sweet potato. And what they found is that when the 100th monkey was trained, all of a sudden there was this exponential shift where all of a sudden all the monkeys started peeling the sweet potato. And it's this, we see this in consciousness. We see this with fads. We see this with the zeitgeist of something. There's this place where the collective, it starts rumbling, and then the roar shifts it to the tipping point where then it becomes a new reality. And that's something that's an underbelly of all the healing, whether it's with personal healing or collective healing. And we've been bearing witness to that on some major sociological and political movements in these last years that are very apparent. And then the next thing I just want to look at here is, how do you do this? What are ways to neutralize your ego? What are ways? And of course, our Vigo, works in here, and it's, bearing witness. We've been talking about that and how to do that. It's, the groups that are doing that. You're all welcome to join Peacemakers International. I've become a member of that. It's something I deeply respect. Their work is quite noble and beautiful and has so much integrity. Constellation work, if any of you are familiar with family constellation, and family constellation work extends also to just constellation work. You can work with groups in society. It's not just relegated to one's family. Radical forgiveness work. So you have traditional forgiveness, which is, okay, you've harmed me and I forgive you. I have compassion for you. Radical forgiveness is quite bold to the ego. The ego will usually initially not like radical forgiveness. It will have a rebellion to radical forgiveness. It will say that can't be the case. And what radical forgiveness, the premises of radical forgiveness is that I have actually, and this is bold, and I bring in a lot of sensitivity if this is going to push any buttons, what I'm about to say is that I have attracted this incident. Now, that is a very daring thing to say to a sexual abuse survivor who is fresh with their sexual abuse, or someone who has been swindled or embezzled, or is that when you are in those initial states of shock, it's not the sensitive thing to say to someone, okay, well, let's get on to radical forgiveness and accept that you attracted this. That is incompassionate. That is uncompassionate behavior. So we don't want to ever take that too fast. And that brings in a word that I didn't write here, but is the word of titration. That when you have trauma, this is a very important word. And it's important whether you're dealing with the personal or the collective, is that titration must be respected. And this word comes from chemistry. This is the idea of using little doses. So if you take a test tube and you put one element in it, and then you add another chemical in it at the same time, you could have an explosion. But if you take one element and you just put a little drop, a little tincture of that other element, there might be a little bubbles and a little bit of action, a little smoke, but there won't be an explosion. And then if you just titrate and let the solution adapt and accommodate bit by bit, the whole test tube can take both chemical element solutions and become one with zero explosion. And that is exactly how it works at the emotional level, both individually and collectively. And we see this very much with, again, I'm going to use these two examples of the Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement, of working with, for example, I've been privy to quite a few communities of women who have had to say, okay, yep, we have this, but where have we been also playing victim? Where have we been fawning? Where have we not taken full responsibility and being willing to go for broke? I love that expression, where we're willing to release everything. And that was with some of the Harvey Weinstein actresses. A lot of them had to do some really deep soul searching and say, yes, this is really real. The sexism is very real. But at the same time, I have my responsibility of where I was, and this brings in spirituality, where I was too scared, where I didn't trust my source of divine inspiration enough, that if I said no, that my good would be looked out after. That if I didn't say no to this man, that I would still have a job. And if I lost that job, then another job. And so this brings in spirituality very much so, that in order for trauma work to be the most effective, that again, I come back to the neutralization of the ego, but it's not just the neutralization of the ego, it's coming in contact with an identity of ourselves that is more than just that ego state, and that can accommodate what is the collective healing that is asked of us when we're confronted with collective trauma. So these are some other spiritual and emotional breathwork modalities, are both spiritual and emotional in their tempering of ourselves and opening up the content and processing content. Fasting and prayer rituals. When we enter into prayer or fasting, we enter into higher states of consciousness, the alpha and theta levels of consciousness, which immediately neutralize the ego automatically. A lot of the retreats I lead in the desert, fasting in some version, mostly on water, is the usual. Some people have accommodations given health, is immediately people enter into an automatic state, a higher state of consciousness, and then the healing begins. Vision quests, truth and reconciliation committees I talked about, and then parent circle or other encounter groups like Summer gave examples of. So we would like to open this up to questions. And Summer, if there's anything you want to comment on before we open up with questions, and I'm going to stop my sharing and if you have a question, I'm just going to ask you to raise your hand with your little, if you see at the bottom, there is a little reaction button you can hit, and you can raise your hand there. It says raise hand. So please, I'm just going to put this on gallery so I can see if anybody has.
I'll jump in really quick and then
Please.
make this question, Cyntha. Is just when you mentioned all the things that can help, and you mentioned Arvigo, I think as a practitioner, being with other people's bodies and the trauma in their bodies and being able to put your hand on a belly that's quaking has been one of the most powerful ways of bearing witness to the human condition. And so I just wanted to name, like, in our own small ways, it's like we all have access to seeing another, whether it's on these global levels or the trauma of a person in front of us. And that was significant. Like, I was just having gratitude after gratitude for all the bodies that had laid there and opened themselves up. And I think there was something else, but I'll jump in later if necessary, but thank you.
I'm so glad you said that. I'm so glad you said that. And just, you know, for some of you who are meeting Summer for the first time, I just always am in awe of her gift of articulation and poetic license in the way that she expresses herself. So just the way you shared that, thank you. That's just, that humbles me as both personally in terms of just being, you know, touched by that, as well as professionally reminding myself of the same. Yeah. Yeah.
And the only other thing is just, we'll probably stop recording now if people have any personal questions, so that's not a video, but thank you for your incredible teaching, Cyntha. So grateful.
Thank you, Summer. Thank you for inviting me.